Have you ever wondered what makes a good story? On this episode of the Comedic Podcast, we had Margot Leitman, the award-winning storyteller and best-selling author of the book Long Story Short. I've personally read Margot's book twice, once years ago and once in preparation for this interview, and I must say it's one of the best books I have ever read. Margot has won many awards related to storytelling, including several Moth StorySLAMs and the Moth GrandSLAM. She's been featured on several of NPR's podcasts, including the Moth Podcast, Good Food, and others. She worked for This American Life. Margot and I talk about the anatomy of a good story. We talk about what people can do if they're fearful of storytelling. We talk about what people can do if they feel like they don't have good stories. And we also talk about the importance of good storytelling in business. I hope this interview inspires you to tell your story and learn the art of storytelling. You're listening to the Combinate Podcast, a show that connects you to the most important resource in the medical device and pharma industries. It's people. My name is Subi Sadeh. I'm a bioengineer, and for the last decade I've sought to broaden my understanding in this industry and have been amazed at the wonderful people I've met and the insights they've given me. Each week, I sit down with leaders to discuss their expertise, the lessons they learned, and continue that mission. Whether you're a student, engineer, scientist, or marketer, you're sure to pick up advice and knowledge that you can apply to make an impact. Now on to the episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Combinate Podcast. I'm your host, Subi Sadeh. Today, we are honored, dare I say, graced by Margot Leitman. Margot Leitman is an author and storyteller. She's been on many podcasts. She worked for NPR, This American Life, and she wrote a book called Long Story Short, which I've had on my shelf for a while. And it wasn't until recently that I thought, maybe I shot in the dark, maybe I can get Margot on. And I'm just so truly honored to have her on the show. Her book, I felt, was one of the most impactful books I've read in my whole life. And so I just wanted to thank you, Margot. Would you mind just giving a brief intro about yourself? Welcome to the show, and just talk about, kind of your journey into storytelling, because it's a really interesting one.
Sure. Yeah, I started in the field of comedy and performance. I have a theater degree, and out of college, that's what I was working in. And I started to fall out of love with stand-up comedy, which is a weird thing because most people really love it. And I started to just want to do something more from the heart. And I kind of, at a certain point, started, instead of doing my stand-up set, started just telling full-length stories in my gigs. And it was working. And I thought, what if I could figure out a way to do this for a living, tell stories for a living? And basically, once I made that decision, I really figured out a business model pretty quickly and began a live storytelling show, which transformed into a tour, which transformed into teaching classes and eventually writing books on the subject and being hired all over the world by various companies and organizations. And I've written 3 books on the subject now, and it's taken over my life. But yeah, it all started with this feeling of, I don't love what I'm doing, which was stand up, but I loved like a different altered version of it, which was telling stories. And it's just a dream come true to be able to do it for a living.
Did that change come gradually to you? Were you in love with stand-up at one point and it just kind of lost its life and you wanted to move on to something else? Or how did that kind of shift happen for you?
I don't know. I don't know that I was ever in love with stand-up. That's a good question. I think I always felt like there was a bravado to being a stand-up that I didn't have. I was very into like being vulnerable and being honest. And at times, when stand-ups do that, it's just so wonderful when you see a stand-up do that. But it's also quite funny to see, somebody like Anthony Jeselnik do this, bravado bit that's so funny as well, and I don't know, it never felt like home to me at all. Definitely backstage at shows. I don't know that I had the toughness that you quite need to make it in that industry. And I was just falling out of love with it. That being said, it was going fine. But I just started to panic before shows. I really did. I would have a show and I remember just like, I would be like lying on the floor panicking or finding out a way to get out of it, because I just really started, it was around about 5 or 6 years into doing it that I just started to just want to do anything, but kind of similarly to having a job that you want, you just don't want to go to, or, you do anything you can to not get out of bed to go to that job. It was sort of feeling like that.
Yeah, I talked to a lot of folks in high school or in college, and I think they, in many cases, feel like they have to figure things out kind of so early on. I'm actually reading a book called Late Bloomers, and it's really interesting to think about kind of like, sometimes you just go through something and you want to be with that for a little while, and you don't want to have that be your whole life.
It's so funny you say that, because there was recently this drug bust in my hometown. And I was reading about it. Somebody sent me the article, and one of the people that was busted in the drug thing was someone that was a drug dealer even when I was in high school. And what I was fascinated by, I was like, wow, this is one of the few people I know that's had one job their whole life. Like, that's what really struck me. I was like, it's really unusual in this day and age to have just one thing you do. And look at him, he just stuck with it. But I do think that it is insane that we ask people at 17, 18 to decide on a major in college of like, what do you want to be? And it's like, people are like, I all of these wild things that we study, and so many people don't go into that. It's understandable. You're asking someone with an unfully formed brain to make a decision about what they'd like to be for the rest of their life. And understandably, many, many people switch.
Yeah. I think, do you know who Robert Greene is? He's a famous author. He wrote 48 Laws of Power, Seduction, Mastery.
Vaguely,
yeah. So he was talking about how, like, he literally, I think, had hundreds of jobs on a podcast, and then all of a sudden just starts writing books and they take off. I mean, he's had maybe half dozen New York Times bestsellers, something insane. Right. And that wasn't until I think he reached his maybe 50s or 40s or something like that. So
I heard a statistic once that most people publish their first book in their 40s. And that makes sense. That was one of the first few things that I guess I was not a late bloomer at, but I published in my 30s first. But I do think that makes sense that people do, and then they have these amazing careers after that, for sure.
And so what motivated you to write your book? I mean, I think in reading your book, I understood why you went into storytelling. I understood why you went into teaching storytelling as well. Can you talk about what motivated you to write your book?
Yeah, I can. It was very simple. I was at the time that I was just coming off of there was a period in my life where I would fly from New York to LA to San Francisco, back to New York, all within a week, every week, to teach workshops. And it was exciting and invigorating. And then I went to, soon after that, I was in Australia for a while, but I had this moment I was like, I'm one person here, but if I can put what I am teaching into a book, then people all around the world can use this, and maybe I can, not that I mind traveling, I love it actually, and I drastically missed it over these last few years, but there's only so much one person can do. So I thought, that was my thought, was like, people everywhere can use these practices if I can't be there in person. But what I didn't think would happen is that it would be used as widely as it is. I truly thought that this was going to be used in like a performance capacity for theater people, like what I have a degree in. And that's what I thought. I never thought it would be used in businesses and in technology and in sometimes people that are religious speakers. I've been spoken at conferences for that. I never in a million years thought it would be used. I would be speaking at science conventions or anything like that. So it blew my mind. But it is funny because it came out, and then almost a year to the date that it came out, it hit a bestsellers list. So it's like what you're saying. And then that's when it really took off. And I truly don't even know why. It was on my birthday, a year after it came out, I woke up and it had it was the #1 audiobook in the country. And I was like, okay, there we go. And then it really, really took off.
How did you like living in Australia? I've done some work with Australians, and I really love their culture.
There's a great storytelling culture in Australia. I was in Perth,
Oh,
which
okay.
is on the other side of the country. So I was there for 6 weeks. I had a great time. We started up I worked with a theater company there, and we started up a wonderful organization that's still going today. And great stories. Very, different types of stories than you hear in America, which is great because I've done some work in India as well. And it's interesting to hear, when you go to another country and you hear the stories that people tell, they tell stories about different things everywhere. So that's my favorite part about this job, is going to a culture and hearing the stories that the culture has to share.
Yeah, the reason that I asked the question about the Australian culture is I did some kind of training just to understand, kind of before I started working with them. And what I found to be just so unique is how kind of straight they are, how vulnerable they are. They just are straight to the point, not in a rude way or anything like that, but you talk about that a little bit in your book, and we'll get to it. But I wanted to ask you about the formatting of your book. So just a little bit about me personally. I love quotes. We talked about that a little bit earlier. But I guess the way that I see your book structured is like quote / topic / axiom in the beginning, at the top. And then you start asking, I don't know if you're asking yourself, but it's like a Q&A to help you think about what are the questions related to this topic. And then you kind of close about, with some important things to consider. I'm just wondering what got you to that format, because I loved it.
Oh, thank you. I mean, aside from the quotes, it's pretty much the way I teach, which is that I go in with here's what we're going to think about today, which is emotion. And then here's why this is important. Now you're going to do some exercises with me. Now you're going to put this into the world, and here's how we're going to do it. I am not a fan in my own teaching practice of just talking at people and hoping that they absorb it, lecturing. Even when I get asked to do a lecture, I like to make it participative. So I was trying to translate the participative aspect of my live workshops into the book. In terms of quotes, I just have a weird, freakishly good memory, and things stay with me in a way that I think about them often and will remember a quote years later. And so I think that, it speaks to a certain type of brain, and I think you share that type of a brain with me. Yeah.
Can you talk about, I know a lot of people that maybe think they don't have a lot of good stories, and you start your book by talking about kind of those people. So what do you have to say to people who say, I don't have a lot of good stories?
The people that say they don't have good stories are usually the most interesting. It's the people that think they're interesting that suck. It's when a person walks in and they're like, my life is crazy, get ready. I'm like, oh God. But when the person is so like, they don't think they have anything, what I'm excited about is to pull stuff out of that person, to try to draw it out. It's like this. It's like, the class clown is often not the funniest person in the room, right? It's that quiet person in the corner that says one thing and that's hilarious. So that's the same thing about that, is that nobody's boring. We all have interesting stories to tell. We've all been through a challenging time these past few years where we haven't gone out and lived life as much. But that doesn't mean that we haven't developed stories about the minutia of our daily lives that became in these last few years. No one is boring. We all have interesting stories to tell. We're just numb to that. And that's the basic thing. And so you've got to just do these exercises to pull things out from your past and remember stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the stories that I also thought was funny was, I think, the Christmas cookie story.
Oh, I love it. Yes.
Yeah. Can you high level tell the story?
Yeah, she wrote this really small story that was like one of my favorite stories I've ever heard, about how she was gonna make these fortune cookies for her company for the holiday party, and she was putting like insider company lingo in the fortune cookies. She had like written the fortunes in the right font and cut it out, doing it by hand. And she had this big fantasy that she was going to start this business. She was going to leave her job and start the fortune cookie business, and that like her life was going to be amazing and she could live anywhere she wanted and do this. And then she brought the cookies to the party and people were like, just put them in the back. And not only did no one eat them, no one noticed them, they like crumbled. But the way that she told it was that she was so devastated by it that the next morning she was like, I'm going to be stuck at this job forever. I'm never moving to Bermuda. I've never started. And like, she couldn't get out of bed the next day. And I found it so funny that it's not that I baked cookies, no one ate them. It was like this emotional response that she had to it was just so funny to me, that it was life or death to her, that it's just one of my favorite stories. And I think it's like, that's what when people say, oh, you don't have anything interesting to say, it's like, well, it could be, you just have to have really cared about it. And if you really cared about it, I will totally listen. I told a story the other day in a live show about the workout program that I got really into during the pandemic. That's it. That's what it was about. And but people related to like how crazy I went with it and how I started really focusing on the people in the background working out and wondering all the stories about everybody. And it's a very small story, but it worked really well. And it was really about nothing, So I think you have to not discount the small stuff, because if you care and emotionally care about something, then you'll be good.
So I guess related to that, one of the things that that was a sort of a central theme is that no one cares about you. When they're hearing a story, they're hearing themselves. And the cookie story, how many of us have taken something to a party and not have it eaten? Right. Everybody, I'd say everybody's gone through that. Right. And so, you can see yourself in that. Can you talk about no one caring about you, and how can people take that idea and bring it into their storytelling?
So you have to think about what is universal about this story. Is there a broader theme that you can pepper in? And I think that, like with that cookie story, you could go even broader with that, which is more so like, have you ever given your all to something and think it was going to change your life and have it completely fizzle out? And then in that regard, you can look at that. And I have friends that are actors that say they feel that every day, So, or even in science, you think this is going to change everything, and it just doesn't work. I'm going to change the world. And it's like, well, no, you're not. So you have to look at broader themes of a story, and then that's how people will care about it. So you have to look at this and go, am I being self-indulgent, or can I tell this story with a way that it feels like everybody's story? So how do I make this about everyone? How can I, in the first few sentences, include everyone into this story and feel like we've all gone through something together? Now here's my specific experience with that thing that we've all gone through together. And then that's how we bring everybody into a story. When it becomes just about you, at a certain point, you do feel like the audience is the therapist to the storyteller, and which is, a totally different situation than what we're going for here.
You talk about starting stories with so in that way. Why is that important?
I don't think it's vital. In fact, there's many people that disagree with me about it.
Yeah.
I'm like, really, look, there's like 10 of us that are like, do what I do. They have very different opinions about it, and we're all total dorks. But I'll say this. It's not necessarily that you start with the word so, it's that you start like you're in the middle of something really exciting. And I use this when I write other things as well. It's like, you don't need to give us 1,000 backgrounds of everything that's going on. Just start like you're telling a story to a group of people. And that's a good word that you might use when you're telling a story to friends. So it doesn't sound so stoic and pre-rehearsed, like it's a presidential speech. You want it to sound conversational. That's why I say that. But also when I write, I've written many other things besides stories in these books. And it's like, it's a rule I think about also when writing scenes, is that you try to start in the middle of the scene rather than, hello, my name's Dr. Watson. Okay, my name's Samantha. How may I help you? You don't start there. You start in the middle of the scene where they sit down and they go, we have your test results here. It's the same thing. And that's exciting to watch in film and television, right? So same thing with a story. You don't need to give me 1,000 background. Get to it.
Yeah, that's really funny. The people who want to start with so and the people that don't want to start with so. You reminded me of, Shark Tank. There's
Yeah,
Kevin O'Leary who
I
is
love
he
Shark
says
Tank.
yeah, he says he's a peanut butter collector, aficionado or whatever, and he says there's a refrigerate the peanut butter or don't refrigerate it kind of sect. And so there's the
What is
so
he
and the
in?
not so.
He's
What
in
is
the
it?
knot or the do.
I actually I'm not sure, to be honest. I just remember that there's factions, I guess.
A
Um,
lot of things in the world that there are factions of, which I find it to be like really funny. I just had a student the other day talking about like people that care the way the dishwasher is loaded and people that just don't care. And I agree with that.
I guess going back to the no one cares about you, what are some examples of, ways that people can start the story where they can, bring people in?
I think you can start with inclusive statements rather than exclusive statements, is the way to think about it. Am I making a statement that includes the majority of people, or am I making a statement that excludes? So what I mean is you don't want to start the story with saying, when I got my doctorate and graduated with honors, I was a little nervous about going out into the world, right? Like that's a little bit of an exclusive statement that very few people are going to tap into, right? Or you can say, I felt lost when I first entered the professional world. I had no idea where I could go. That's a different, you're saying the same thing, right? But you're saying it in an inclusive way that includes most of us rather than exclusive. And that's the best way I can say. I never want people to lie and pretend that they're less successful than they are. I don't want people to pretend, water down their achievements and pretend something like that. But you have to think about a way that brings everybody in. And then after you've brought everybody in, you can be as specific as you need to be. But bring people in the beginning so that we feel like we're a part of this.
How important is the beginning and end of a story in comparison to the middle?
I think it's all important. I think to be frank, the most important thing about the beginning is getting to it quickly. But I think you can have a mad beginning if your end is really, really strong. I think the end is probably what people will remember. I also think you can tell a mediocre story, but if your end is just really amazing, I don't think people are really going to care. I actually heard a story the other night that rambled a bit, but the end tied like everything together that I thought he was rambling about. And actually it was like a puzzle. It all came together at the end. And I was like, oh, brilliant. So, I definitely didn't care that he rambled a bit in the middle because I just loved it so much. So I've heard stories from over a decade ago that I can remember the last line of that were just very impactful for me. And I don't know that I remember the first line. So, and you think about that with maybe not books. Books, I think we often remember the first line of, but I think with film, we also often remember the last moment rather than the first. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think before I asked the question, I thought you were going to say the beginning is the most important part, to be honest. But it makes sense. Most people, when they start something, it's generally not that glorious. And once you spend time doing it, the longer you do it, you eventually be. Maybe I'm drawing a life theme out of it that only makes sense.
I'm talking about oral storytelling. I would say
Right.
for personal essay or book writing, I think the beginning is vital. Otherwise, they're just going to stop reading.
I have a question actually about that. Well, I'll ask it now. What do you think is harder, writing stories or narrating stories?
You mean orally
Telling, yeah, orally telling, yeah, orating.
writing?
Really?
Yeah, for me. And that's because
Okay.
I think it's specific to me because I have a performance background. I have a theater degree. So I can take a story and I can sell it in a way that on paper, I really need to make it shine. So I think that when I first began, I was very reliant on a little look or a tone of voice for something so you could see what I felt. And then because my very first book was a memoir and a book of stories from my awkward teenage years. And a lot of those stories were developed on stage. And I truly believed, I was like, I'm going to print out what I say on stage and I'm going to staple it and I'm going to turn it in and that's going to be the book. And they're like, no. Like, while on stage, you may say like, and we were having a great time, and being sarcastic. In the book, you have to say we were not having great time. The way that I felt when this was happening was like, I had to really go into great detail because I wasn't there to read it. So I think that is harder. I also, when I teach storytelling, but I also teach memoir writing, personal essay writing. And when we do people turn things in that are meant to be read, I never let the person that wrote it read it in the class, because I always say, if you're going to turn this into an editor and try to sell this, you will not be there to read it. So we need to know that it stands alone. So,
so that's really interesting. So, tone has a picture is 1,000 words type thing, where if you have the right tone, you can, say the same thing with much less. Can you talk about fear as it relates to storytelling?
Yeah, I think fear gets in our heads in a lot of different careers, but if you let fear get in the way, you're never going to write or do anything. So there's that feeling of, I'm going to write this story and so is going to find out about it, and then my life is going to be destroyed. And then so you just don't write it. You just don't do it. But there's other ways to do it, which is that you have to think about, well, am I telling the other person involved story, or am I telling my story of what happened? Because the story shouldn't be, look at how crazy this person was, but look at how unstable I was in my life that I let things get out of control, right? You have to put it on you, and you are at the center of the story. And then you can minimize the other characters, change their names, change their identifying characteristics, but keep it on you. That pretty much helps with a lot of the fear. And then the other thing is, you choose where your story lives. There are stories that I have written that I just wrote and I was like, well, that's cool, but I don't think they're ever gonna see the light of day. But I'm glad I wrote it, and I'm glad I did that exercise. And there's some that I will scream from the rooftops. But I just think fear never helped anybody creatively,
Do you think it comes down to just being more vulnerable? I understand the fear of not offending somebody or oversharing something that maybe they didn't want to get out, where you led with, but just the fear of performance or fear of what people will think of your story. How much does just being vulnerable play into that?
Performance fear is one of the top 3 or so fears, I think. So it's a real thing for many people. But I think people are afraid to be vulnerable because they think it will destroy their lives if they are vulnerable. And then I always say, well, look at Oprah. It changed her career for the better to be vulnerable. It made her everyone's best friend once she was vulnerable. It changed it all. It's the thing that people remember about Oprah, not that she's a billionaire, but that all of her vulnerabilities. So I always say, look at Michael Phelps, look at these people that were vulnerable in their professional lives and their personal lives, and then it paid off and what ended up being a second career. However, I do think in business a lot, and I work with a lot of businesses, vulnerability is attached to weakness, is attached to a sinking company, is attached to a lot of other things. And then it's like, okay, well then how do you do that well? And I think a company like Nike did it really well when everything happened with Colin Kaepernick, and they really used that to tell a story and include the vulnerability of that situation, that very, very volatile situation, and include it in a way that they came out on top and used that story incredibly well. And that to me is a corporate story of vulnerability that I found to be incredibly moving. So I don't know. I think a lot about that. Like, there's a period Lorne Michaels wasn't attached to SNL, and that's part of his story. There's a period Steve Jobs was not with Mac, and that's a part of his story. And these people are icons, So I don't know. It's a conflicting thing, vulnerability, for a lot of people, especially in business. And I get it. I feel it. I understand.
I wanted to ask you about truth. You alluded to, you never want people to dilute their achievements. You never want people to, not tell the truth. I loved the 2 quotes that you put in the truth section of the book. They were both by Mark Twain. I think one of them you said was maybe only attributed to him, not formally given to him. But the 2 quotes, the first one you said you disagreed with, which is never let facts get in the way of a good story. You said you disagreed with that. And then the second one, which I love, and I've loved for a long time. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. So I thought it was funny that they were both by Mark Twain. But can you just talk about the importance of truth in a story? I think this is obviously important for my audience. Where we're regulated industry, we have to tell the truth. We have to be diligent with how we tell the truth. Good documentation practices and all of that. And so, can you just talk about truth in storytelling?
Well, if you look about truth in criminal cases, what they look for is if a person's story changes, they are likely not telling the truth, right? So, I mean, that's what goes on in that world. So if you think about this in the storytelling world, I do agree that if you keep your story true, you never have to worry about your next line. You just have to worry about what happens next in your story because you're telling the truth. And so I don't memorize stories by lines. I write the story out and then I write the moments that I need to remember. And it's just, I always say it's your life. How could you forget it? Just talk about that. In terms of where are places we can fudge the truth in storytelling? Obviously, for me, I often change people's names and identifying characteristics to protect them. That being said, there are certain places like my former employer, This American Life, that you can't do that, or the New Yorker or the New York Times. You do have to put real names, or you can put things like the dentist in or something like that, but you can't, if the dentist is Dr. Klein, you can't call him Dr. Clark. So there's those things. So it depends on where you're doing the story. But for me, I tend to, and in my books, I change names and I change identifying characteristics. And that's a big thing that you can keep untruthful. I will say that, if you don't remember the exact number, that's not a big deal. Give me a number around. Or I've also said that it's okay to fudge a timeline a little bit for the sake of clarity. And the example I give is I tell a story that takes place over 2 different summers at a summer camp, but I've condensed it into one summer because it's at the same place with the same people. And it really just, what the emotional truth of what happened is there. It's just kind of slows the story down to have me leave and go back to the camp. So in those regards, I would say and I even have a chart about this in the book of where is it okay or not okay. But in terms of, timelines a little bit for the sake of clarity, names, exact numbers, I think all of that is okay to fudge. It's not okay to make up an ending so your story seems more theatrical. All that will do is turn your audience on you and think that you've wasted their time and been completely insincere. So that's the big thing I see a lot, is people fabricating endings to make something more grandiose. And I would really stay away from that.
You have a line in your book that I still fully haven't processed, to be honest. It's your story is only as strong as its truths. I think I've gained a little bit more from your answer there. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about only being as strong as its truths. Is it as simple as passing the red face test in terms of somebody asking you, you're being insincere or you're lying, and you say, no, I'm not, and you actually can sort of defend that and say that all I did was adjust a couple things to make the story easier to hear. I did it for you as opposed to make me look great?
I think that a truth is your emotional truth of how something feels at the time. And I will actually give an answer to this that is not from me, but from one of my favorite interviews I've heard from David Sedaris, one of my favorite writers. Do you know him? Are you familiar with his work?
No, I'm not, but I saw his name a few times in your book.
Yeah. So he in an interview was talking about how he was down south and he was with his brother-in-law and he went to Costco because his brother-in-law needed to get olive oil. And he was doing this, David Sedaris was doing a book tour where he was giving everybody a condom after he signed the book as like a giveaway, right? And so he goes to Costco with his brother-in-law in the South, and all he gets, or it's either his brother or his brother-in-law, I can't remember, but it was 2 men, and he gets a giant thing of olive oil, and he, as he described it, a cinder block sized box of condoms, and they're walking around in this Costco with this, and it just looks like wild, right? Like, what are these 2 guys up to? And he said he was writing this article for somewhere, the New Yorker or the Times, where they fact check everything. And they called him and they said, well, we've called Costco. And they said that the largest box of condoms that they have is the size of a brick, not a cinder block. So can you change it? and he said, but it felt like a cinder block. It felt massive and humiliating, and like everyone was staring at me, and that I was, that no one, and that's how it felt. And I feel like I should be able to say that because that was the feeling that I had, and I want the audience to feel, and I think that is such a great example of that I think about that interview I heard with him all the time. It's like, how did this feel? And I think the problem that people say is that we're walking through and I felt like, F you guys, here I am. And that isn't how he felt, he felt insecure in that moment. So that's the difference. It's like that emotional truth. It doesn't matter if it's a brick or a cinder block. Like I care about that feeling that he had. So.
That's so interesting. I mean, the fact checking, do they go into that much detail?
I mean, I used to work for This American Life, and yeah,
right.
like we would fact check things to a point of, sorry, there's a helicopter or something. We would fact check things like, yeah, I mean, if you said, I used to intern I worked on a story where she was interning for somebody, and they had to contact the person and say, did you intern for this person? Even though she didn't even name him, she called him like the boss or something like that. They fact checked it. Yeah. Certain places, if you're going to tell a story on stage, if you're going to write a story for Medium, places like that, I don't think that they do. I could be wrong, but it depends on the place.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. I wanted to ask you about the universal theme. You mentioned that you're you said you didn't like Gossip Girl because you couldn't relate to it, but you loved Friday Night Lights. I love Friday Night Lights too. Who's your favorite character?
Who's my favorite character? Well, yeah. In terms of looks, Tim Riggins. In terms of integrity, probably Connie Britton's character. I don't remember what her character's name was, but yeah, the Connie Britton character.
That's the coach's wife.
Yeah, but what's her name?
Tammy Taylor.
Tammy Taylor. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. What I liked about her development.
In terms of looks, Tim Riggins, yeah.
No, I agree about Tim Riggins, but I was gonna say what I like about her character is she started off as the coach's wife, and then she took off, and he sort of had to help her as her career really took off. And I really liked kind of the transition, and the kids were getting older, and it was really cool seeing her development. But related to the universal theme, can you talk about the point of entry?
Yes, the point of entry is when you see yourself in the story you are telling. So for me, when you see yourself in the story you are hearing or watching or reading. So for me, watching Friday Night Lights, even though I grew up in New Jersey and not Texas, immediately there was a point of entry where I saw myself in it as the person, wondering, why does this town care so much about football? That I had that feeling of like, gosh, this rules everything, and I just don't understand why everyone cares so much. And there were characters in there that did feel alienated from that world. And so I immediately tapped into that, even though I didn't grow up there and I wasn't a part of the football world. I saw myself as where do I fit in this story? I feel included in this story. And I think that's a big thing, is you have a point of entry is when you feel included in something specifically applies to your exact life. So, I'm telling you, I worked in Australia, and you're going, I've studied Australia. I'm in because I have a point of entry for that. So it's different than universal theme, which is a broader theme. It's a point of entry is a specific moment. There's broader themes, for example, in Friday Night Lights that I identified with, sure. But the specificity of that football town, I was immediately in.
Yeah, I will also say Matt Saracen is one of my favorite characters. For me, my
second favorite in terms of crush, but yeah.
Well, for me, with him, it was the point of entry. I think was more the low expectations for a second string quarterback, and when people have to face the music, they generally do it well, and he did. And I thought that was really cool.
I agree with that.
I wanted to ask about passion. You talk about the importance of passion. I used to be a barista myself and was super into coffee. I roasted coffee and things like that, and had this dream. Maybe it's kind of related to stand up where I really wanted to open up a coffee shop. And I worked while I was an engineer, I worked nights and weekends as a barista to try to learn the craft. And then just realize, hey, this was a phase. I still like coffee. I'll still continue to do it, but it's not what I want to do with my life. And, but people say, why are you so passionate? It's just a cup of coffee, relax. Can you talk about passion as it relates to storytelling and how, a simple cup of coffee maybe can become a lot more than that if you tell the story right?
Yeah, I mean, you're saying it pretty well in what you've just said. It's about strong passion for or against something can make a story really shine. So, thinking about that, if you really love coffee, I could listen to you tell a story about coffee and I'd be there. But I can also I just heard someone tell a great story about their hatred for Christmas the other day in a workshop I taught. And even though I love Christmas, I loved everything that she had to say, and I thought it was a very funny story. So I do think strong passion for or against something will make or break a story. But if you tell a story, so you can't tell stories about things you're indifferent to. You have to tell stories about things you're excited about. And the humor, which I love, is when you are really excited about something really dumb, rather than really excited about something that really matters. That can even get like hilarious, so telling a story about your passion for civil rights, it's probably not going to be funny because it's an important issue, but telling your story about your passion for new socks could be great and hilarious because it's like something unworthy of that passion, right? Or so I think that when we have strong opinions on things that are unworthy of our strong opinions, it can get hilarious. So you have to think about it in those terms, like what are things that, and I have a lot of exercises in the book that help you draw, what are these little things that I feel really passionately about? And in fact, that's what drew me to write this story that I just did about 2 weeks ago about, this dumb workout program I did for half the pandemic, because I got like so obsessed with it. And I thought, well, maybe an audience would care. And they did. And nobody in the audience had ever done this workout program or cared about it, but they cared about how obsessed I got with it. And they all said, you know what? I got obsessed with something dumb during the pandemic too. I can relate to this. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a quote in your book where you talk about the one guy who had such a strong opinion about people who wear top hats and how much he hated it. Yeah.
My favorite writers. Yeah. Yeah, he hates them.
Yeah.
And that's actually a written essay. You can find that in his book, Role Models, if you want to check it out. But that's a great example of passion against something driving it. Yeah, he has a whole essay on his hatred of top hats and role models, and it's fantastic. You can't see it, but I have a quote on my wall from John Waters, speaking of us loving quotes. Yeah.
Yeah. What is it?
Well, it says, if you go home with somebody and they don't have any books, don't what them.
Okay, moving on. So I wanted to talk about perspective. So in your book, you told this first. You talked about a morning routine where your son wakes up, and you just stoically is not the right word. You just maybe clinical is a better word. You just observingly wrote. Wrote what are the facts, and then you told two different perspectives. And I was just thinking about my wife, because my daughter is kind of the same way. She could have totally related to the story. I related to both perspectives. Can you just talk about perspective?
Yeah. So one way you could write it is, I can go through I'll go through my present day life because I wrote that a few years ago, but it's like, wake up, take dog out, make coffee, make breakfast for children, make school lunches for them, get them outdoor, right? Like that's the morning. And that's so clinical and instructional, like it would be in a cookbook or something, right? So then the other way to tell it is with a perspective. So then you go like, wake up, oh, I wish I could sleep for another 2 hours. Why did I stay up all night watching that teen drama? I'm a little too old to be watching teen dramas. What's wrong with me? Grow up. But you know what? It was pretty good. And then like already you can start to see, which is really something I just got into a show called Cruel Summer for a 16-year-old. So good. But like literally that's my weakness, so then you can start to get to know someone through that. But that's, their inner monologue and their perspective on it. But otherwise it's just this clinical morning that sounds like nothing. So what I say is people don't attach to the facts of the story. They attach to how you felt about what happened. And that's more interesting. We're often more interested in the emotional truth of the story than the events. And that's a very interesting way to look at telling a story, but it's different, but it's true. So the way you might feel about an alarm, I know people whose alarm goes off, including my husband, and they jump out of bed and they are ready to seize the day. And like, that is a very different way that he's going to write about starting his day than myself. We're in the same bed.
Yeah, one of my brothers uses like the bomb shelter alarm or whatever it is, the giant beep beep beep, and wakes up the whole house, and he doesn't wake up.
He doesn't wake up through it.
And he doesn't wake up. Yeah. Can you talk about layering a story? I really like you started with the Pete the Cat, because I know that story and I've read it to my daughter so many times, and I just we've listened to it as well, and it always says, and it's all good, and yeah.
But they also specifically say, and the moral of the story is that, and that's problematic in telling stories as an adult. And I've actually done workshops where I've had people that write children's books in the audience, and they've said, we even try to stay away from that in children's book writing as well. So we have this desire to spell out the moral of a story. And I think it comes a lot of us from business, whereas you want to wrap it up and get your point in at the end of your PowerPoint presentation to make sure everybody takes that home with them. And I understand that. But when you tell a story, if you tell an audience how to feel at the end of it, it really changes all this time that they've spent feeling whatever it is they were already feeling. So within that story, what I think is great is if you can layer something big throughout it without being so heavy-handed in it, and let people subtly take that message away from you, that's beautiful. And that's absolutely wonderful. You don't ever have to say at the end, now my takeaway is, now I hope you've learned, none of that stuff matters. A good storyteller will layer that in effortlessly.
In that section, you say something to the effect of, it's important that the audience gets a point. It doesn't have to necessarily be the point that you were trying to get across. How do you sort of relinquish control when it comes to that?
What's most important is that they feel something. And if they feel nothing, then you haven't done your job. Like, you heard the story and you didn't feel anything. But I don't know, you ever watch something or read something and someone has watched or read the same thing and they took something completely different from it than you did? That's okay. But I think the person will stop watching or reading if they're feeling nothing. So you have to really relinquish control of your point, and more, do you think I can get this audience to feel or be affected by the story that I'm going to tell? And then that's okay. And I don't know, it's a good thing to remember in life too. Like, does it really matter that someone got your specific point if they feel something and they're moved by it and they're affected by it? Like, I don't know.
I wanted to ask about character. You talk about basically introducing yourself in the beginning, but not being too extra about it. There was an example that you gave where the guy said, I know I look like a vegetarian, or what you think a vegetarian looks like. I've tried that, no more. I also tried cancer and no more, something like that. Instantly hooks everybody, right? What advice do you have for people? Should that introduction change depending on what the story is?
Yeah. Oh, sure. I just say, if there's an elephant in the room, embrace it. So I've done times where, I've been telling stories on stage, 9 months pregnant. I've been telling stories on stage with a and you just do have to work with that. Otherwise it's really distracting. So you own what everyone's thinking, so then they can just move on. I write about a student who's actually become a very well-known comedian who's a wheelchair user. And she says, there was a period where I would never acknowledge that I was a wheelchair user. There's a period that's all I would talk about in my stand-up. And now I found a good balance where, there's a chair, let's move on. And here we go. I'm a fully rounded person. And so I think that there's that aspect of it, it will change based on what the story you are telling. But if there is some sort of, elephant in the room, like I joked something about I think I talked about this, like when I came on stage with a 9-month pregnant stomach and I said, how's everyone doing? I just got off the phone with my mother who told me that this was the stage of pregnancy where she started losing the baby weight. How is your day going? And then I went on with my other story, but I think otherwise people would have been like, is she okay? Is she gonna have a baby on the stage? Like, I think people would have. So, there's that. But you've got to work with what's going on and change it based on the story. So if and I think that it depends on your audience and it depends on what you're telling a story about as well. But yeah, your intro should be concise for sure.
Related to the character, you also talk about rooting for the storyteller. And I really liked a couple of parts of that section in particular, because I never thought of the idea of the flawed protagonist who is still kind of trying to do the right thing, but they have their flaws. And the quote that really hit me hard in that section is, conceal a flaw and the world will imagine the worst. And i.e., it may be better to lead with your weakness, because if you don't, then what they'll imagine the gap is maybe actually greater than that. Can you talk about how can one get someone kind of rooting for you in a story or rooting for the character in the story, and how important that is? How do you set that up?
Yeah, I mean, I always ask workshops, what makes you an underdog? Why would an audience root for you? And it's a worthwhile exercise to literally write these things down of why might an audience root for me? What are things in my life that I have overcome? How am I an underdog? And then you think about that, because that's who we root for, is underdogs. And yes, in sports, there's exceptions. We root for big winning teams often, but we still somehow convince ourselves that we're underdogs. Like, with the Patriots, like they're winning all the time, but it's like, well, Tom Brady's so much older than most football players. So look at that. They're overcoming that. They're underdogs still. You know what I mean? Like, we still convince ourselves that somehow it's an underdog. So, and you look at the media, they do that really well with politicians. They create underdogs in that world. So you've got to think about that for yourself as well and be sincere in that. It's not a pity party. It's just thinking about why would an audience root for me? And when we write stories, we always think, when we read stories, we always think, excuse me, why am I rooting for this character? And if you think about anything that you watch or read, you're always rooting for someone, but often take a step back and go, why am I rooting for this person? Who am I rooting for and why? And acknowledge those things when you are consuming media of any kind. And then it helps you check in with that for yourself as well.
Yeah. So why am I rooting for this person?
Yeah.
Can you talk about no notes, no scripts?
In live performing?
Yeah.
I mean, it depends, but I think that, like, I do it too. I always check with the show. Are you a notes show or a no notes show? And if it's a show that you're telling a story on that they say no notes, let it go. I have so many times that clients or people say, I have to have my notes. I have to. And you do until you don't. So what I say is, don't memorize, don't improvise. That's my other thought, is that you don't memorize your thing word for word, but you also don't just get up there and talk. You remember the moments of it that you have to say. You break it down into memorizable chunks. You think about what moment comes next. You don't memorize it word for word. If something throws off, I've seen lights fall out of a ceiling. I've seen audiences scream at people. I've seen power go out in the middle of shows. Like, what are you going to do if something goes wrong and you are so stuck to a script? So you don't memorize, you don't improvise, and you'll be okay. But I mean, there are shows and performances and speeches here and there that they do want notes, that they say it's okay, and it's up to the producer. That being said, when I give hour-long speeches, I do have some notes on the stage, but I've done hour-long storytelling shows of me just telling stories, and I've had no notes, and somehow I do it.
Yeah, I'll ask maybe the question a different way, because it was layered. In the world of business, where you have PowerPoint presentations, or you're trying to get a point across, in many cases, even you would maybe pull up a PowerPoint and you filled out the notes section in to help you. I guess from your perspective, as you've advised many companies, do you avoid having do you think it's better to have an understanding of what you plan on saying and sort of in the way that I think in the section of your book where you're talking about memorizing a story, don't write down exactly what you're going to say. Just make sure you hit the high level topics, and just have maybe a high level note, or I guess what's your advice in terms of presentation in
It
that way?
depends on who's doing it. I mean, I have been hired by companies before that have said we're too reliant on PowerPoint and we need to understand story. And that's probably the biggest reason a company will bring me in, is that they're saying, we give PowerPoint presentations, we're not getting anything across to the client, and we need to figure out how to really get through to them. So I think there's a middle ground. I think that there is an importance, and I've learned this especially in these past few years. I wrote that book before the pandemic, whereas, now online, when I'm giving a presentation where I used to be in person and I could really sell it online, I do think that there is a value to having some slides and things for people to look at and take notes on. But when there's too much on the slide, I think it just becomes mush. I think, yeah.
What I guess what changes what changes do you make when a client tells you we're not getting the message across?
I go back to the foundations of story, and I teach the company the very basic foundations of how to properly tell a story. And I get the company to tell a personal story each, like from the class that I'll teach. And then from there, they can translate that into their business. But I think if you do, it's like, I danced in college and I wanted to do modern dance. And they're like, well, you have to learn the foundations of ballet first. And I was like, yeah, but I don't want to do that. I want to do modern dance. And they're like, you have to take 4 semesters of ballet and understand the general principles and foundations of dance, and then you can do whatever you want. And I did, and they were right. And I think about that a lot. It's like, you have to understand the general structure and foundation of story. You can go then do whatever you want in your business after that. But if you do not understand how to properly convey a story, I don't understand how you're conveying the origin story of your brand. I don't know how you're conveying the story, in your commercial or whatever that is, wherever you want to, put that across. I mean, and I've worked with, believe me, all types of companies that I sometimes make sense of why they're hiring, and sometimes I don't even know why they need to know this, but they're going to figure it out. I mean, anything from librarians to lawyers to scientists to filmmakers, all different types of places I've worked, and people need it's a basic. I don't really see how there's any downside to knowing how to tell a story.
So I think what I gathered from what you said is what you do with the foundations of storytelling is the end and not the means. The means is, so long as you understand the foundations of storytelling, whether you're telling it by oration, whether you're writing it in the form of a paper, whether you're putting it in a PowerPoint, it's going to come across so long as you understand the foundations of story. When it comes to a product, though, how do you tell a story for a product?
I think you have to attach some sort of personal feeling to it. And I do this exercise in classes. I always say, forget about what your company does. I want to hear about a product you love and have loved your whole life, and why, and what it means to you, and where does that stem from. And almost always it's like, my grandpa, every time I visited, would have a Coca-Cola waiting for me in the fridge. And it's really always, people will think about it and they'll go, oh, actually, I love this because I have this specific memory that goes with it. And then I get people to tell that story, and then they go, oh, okay, this makes sense. I work a lot with origin stories with people as well, because I think people tell the story of that I started doing this. I saw a listing and then I applied and here I am. And it's the world's worst way to tell the story of how you started doing what you're doing, right? So you have to, there's a way to tell that in a more compelling way.
What is the kind of biggest problem that you see when you work with companies? Where do you usually have to start when they bring you in?
I think it's inability to share anything about themselves of the individuals in the company. And I understand that. I do. I understand where everyone's coming from, because I'm coming from this feely artist world. It's very different, and I get that. But that's also the beauty of it. But I think the big thing is that I often work in a group of coworkers that have worked together for years and do not know anything about the other person. And do not know like amazing skills these other people have, or amazing life stories that these other people have that they've worked with. And that's what I think is the biggest barrier, is that a reluctance to tell anything about yourself for fear of being quote unquote found out for whatever it is. And the opposite has been true in every workshop I've ever taught. It creates a closeness amongst the company. It creates bonds. It creates people realizing that a person had a skill set they didn't realize, and that's going to become something that the company is going to use. It goes in. Then there's always people that really, really shine and can tell amazing stories, and then that really transforms. I mean, I've had companies that I've gone to. I'm not taking responsibility, but I'll say this, that there was like a company that then was on the cover of, I shouldn't reveal too much, but anyway, things weren't going so great. And then the next thing you know, they were like on the cover of their version of Time magazine a year later, their version of that for the industry they were in. And it was like a lot of that had to do with a change within the company of how they worked.
Huh. And I think what I gathered from what you said as well is, not only do I not know a lot about the people around me, but they also may not know a lot about me as well. Yeah. And so it's like a double-edged sword there. How has your life changed since you started telling stories? Because I think that, from your book, you tell true stories. You tell true stories of things that actually happened to you. So you're sharing about, things that have actually happened to you. How has your life changed?
I have a way of instantly connecting with people in a way that I find very freeing. I can find connections with strangers all the time now, and I find that to be a wonderful gift to have in this world. I have a way of getting people to be vulnerable with me that aren't normally, and that's been really life-changing to see that in people. But also, I think that my life changed professionally. I mean, when I started telling stories, I was also still doing my theater world and my script writing world and all of these other things. And then it really manifested into a full-time business of writing, teaching, performing, and giving speeches on and working with companies, everything in storytelling. My whole life changed. And I began running my own business and working for myself. So it's one of those things of, I talk in the book of one of my favorite quotes, and I'm getting it wrong, is something like, they say in The Social Network, Harvard grads don't acquire great jobs, they create great jobs, or something like that.
Invent them.
And I sure as hell did not go to Harvard. But I can say this, that I do feel like I'm going to create this job, and the world is going to be along with me for the ride, and my passion is going to drive me, and I'm going to make it happen, and I'm going to find a way to monetize this, and I'm going to do it. It was not that insanely hard once I really set my mind to it.
How long did it take for you to start to see kind of a proof of concept, or the world reacting in a way that unexpected is the wrong word, but a way that was putting wind in your sails?
I would say probably 2 years in, which is not in hindsight that long, 2 years in, I acquired a huge corporate client from them seeing me live and saying, I think this would work really well. I was telling stories in a bar. The CEO of a company was in the audience, and she said, I think my company needs to know how to do this. She contacted me, started working there, teaching, and then from there it exploded. Yeah. I would say that it was probably about 2 years in, maybe. Yeah,
that's awesome. I wanted to ask, it's kind of like a combination of luck and hard work, right? I think the quote that comes to mind is, the harder I work, the luckier I get, and so if you've been at it for 2 years, you also did 2 years of stories where there wasn't a CEO in the audience, and then when there was,
and
you
then
were able to take advantage.
6 years of stand-up, and
right,
where I also had to be a bartender and a waitress and a temp and a substitute teacher and all of these other things, I
heard the story about the substitute teacher where you thought it was going to be, you could probably tell the story, I'm sure, better than me, but you talked about the kid that you had your frustrations with, who said like G Willikers or whatever. I don't remember what
that kid. Yeah. He's the reason I quit. Uh, but that job, I mean, yeah, but I mean, like I had a million survival jobs in my 20s and didn't start really, I mean, we could do a whole other podcast about this, but the truth is like when I was about 30, I was still telling stories. I was still doing stand-up. I just got married and I went deaf in my right ear, suddenly and acutely, which is a story for another time. But I had a sudden acute deafness in my right ear. And it was a really weird moment where I was like, if I would close my left ear, then it was complete silence. It was very scary. And through some treatments, some of my hearing is back and I'm still partially deaf. But that being said, that time in my life was like a wake-up call for me of like, I was unhappy. And I was like, you know what? Like, I'm sorry, can I say that on this podcast? But I was just like, let's go for it. And beep, there we go. Get the beep, get the timestamp and the beep on that. But I definitely in that time. So I say that, like, when I say, yeah, it was like 2 years before things really started off as storytelling. Yes. But after spending my whole 20s being a struggling artist in New York, trying to figure it out, you know, spending 4 years in college on a theater degree and eventually not realizing that acting wasn't my passion, you know? And so it's not 2 years over instant success. It was a very long time before all of this happened. And I say this all the time to people get nervous. I think your 20s are a time of discovery and a time of figuring it out. And I'm so glad I went through that. And I feel like an early bloomer that I sold books in my 30s. And I can't wait to keep going through my 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and however long I'm here, you know, but I do think that I don't want to in any way make it sound like this was really easy, because through all of the things I tried and failed at before this, I got wonderful stories that I use every day in my work and wonderful life experience, and met some of my best friends and amazing people. And I'm so glad I tried a million things that didn't work out. I still have friends from that very first waitressing job from the week I moved to New York City, you know, I mean, and I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, I really connect with that. I sold cell phones all through college and I did it full time. And literally hundreds of, you could say, professional interactions. And for me, that just experience was priceless once I got into, working in my profession, because I had seen hundreds of interactions with people where I was a face and I was, dealing with them signing a contract. And, they weren't $1 million contracts, but they were still contracts.
Absolutely.
And yeah. And so I really relate to that. And I appreciate you highlighting that. And I wasn't trying to minimize, I was actually maximizing, saying that it's not like the first fish you went after you weren't even out there fishing.
Yeah.
You were there telling a story and a fish came up and caught you almost. And so I thought that's really cool. I wanted to ask you.
One thing though, is that I think I want to make it clear that in a million years, as a person with a theater degree and a stand-up background and all these things, I never in a million years thought that I would be able to go into a corporate business setting and be a person of knowledge in that world. And now I've realized, it's been really eye-opening to realize that is exactly why I'm going in. That took me a while to understand. And we talk about imposter syndrome. I was like, what do I wear?
Right.
What am I doing here? I'm a fish out of water. But then I realized that was exactly why I was there. It took me years. And I think about this about 5 years ago, I gave a speech in a pretty corporate setting to a company in Pennsylvania. And I was I was sort of free in the speech and goofing off a little bit on stage with people. And we were having a good time with volunteers and such. And afterwards, I remember I apologized to the woman who had booked me. And I said, I'm sorry, that went a little off the rails. We got a little silly there. I hope that's okay. I did. I felt like self-conscious about it. And she goes, oh no, we hired you to be the fun speaker at this event. That's exactly why we hired you. And I know it's just one sentence that this woman said to me, but it drastically changed the way I dressed for speeches, the way I presented, everything, because I realized that is why. Of course, I'm not, this is who I am. And so there's a big thing to embracing authenticity in your professional life as well. And that's a big challenge. And that took me many years after my business started to be able to do that. And I do feel like I do it now, but that was probably my biggest hurdle.
What advice do you have for people who are going after a big goal and they feel like they're maybe a fish out of water? You mentioned imposter syndrome.
Uh, what advice do I give to a person that feels like they may be a fish out of water? I think that probably most great leaders have been successful because they were exactly that.
Mm,
So you have to really think about the people that have really succeeded in the world. It's often because they are different than what the way they gave a different spin on what we think about blank to be.
mm. So
Like,
I guess what I
yeah,
gathered from that is if you feel like you're sucking for air, then you might be in the right place to stay there.
maybe,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, what books do you give as gifts
To
besides your own?
who? To friends.
Anybody?
I can tell you the books that I'm obsessed with. I love everything by David Sedaris. I think we can all learn so much from the way that he effortlessly writes personal, true stories. In terms, I liked Stephen King's On Writing a lot, especially the first half of it. I found that to be a really good book about writing. I often refer students to read Spalding Gray's monologues. So if you want to know an early adapter of this form of telling stories, he would write very long form stories. But in terms of like the book itself is very short, but he would tell like an hour-long story. And I find those to be very, very, very helpful. You can read anything by Nora Ephron. Who's a great, great, great woman to read books by. I could go on for a very long time.
Yeah. Which book by David Sedaris would you recommend most?
Calypso.
Calypso?
Mm-hmm.
And what
It's
advice do you have for people who don't read a lot but want to?
I understand that. Your brain may be fried from just having a baby or being in a state of grief or working overnights or whatever that is. And I understand that. But you can still listen to books and audiobooks. You can find, if that's expensive, then you find a library app and you can do it in that way. And then, or you can read short things, like you can read one essay by so-and-so and you can gain a lot from it just by reading a personal essay by this person or an article by this person. But I always say this because there's a lot of people out there that consider themselves writers, but they don't read. And I always say a writer reads. All readers don't write, but all writers should read.
I really like read short things. And I think just reading, you don't have to read books. Reading is not reading books, it's reading. And so if you read an article or you read an essay, that's really cool. I guess to end on a high note, I wanted to ask you to tell folks the story about The Price is Right, because I love that story. Hearing you say it, maybe if you could spend a few minutes. If not, we can end the interview. I totally understand.
Oh, you can't say that and then say, but it's okay if you don't. Okay, so
Yeah.
I grew up like many people loving The Price is Right. And my father and I would have a disagreement about it all the time because my father was very, very smart. And he would always say, it's a show for stupid people. You're not allowed to watch it in this house. So I would sneak off and I would watch it, and try to hide it from him. So when we moved, we didn't even move to LA. We came out to LA and I was like, I want to go to a taping of The Price is Right. And everyone I knew told me that I had to, be really enthusiastic and make sure to have nothing to do, have a really boring job, to be able to answer these questions before you go in. So when you go there, you wait in line and they ask everybody in the audience, like, what's your name? Where are you from? And what do you do for a living? And I decided to just say I was a teacher. That way I wouldn't be kind of anything artsy fartsy or anything like that. I could be normal. But then they asked me, what do you teach? And I was like, so I teach the art of storytelling to adults. And they were like, what? And so because everyone's like, I'm an accountant. I teach horseback lessons, but nobody had a weird job, So then we go in. And before I go in, I say to the security guard, I say, what do you have to do to get picked? And he goes, oh, you got to pray. I was like, okay. So I go in, and as soon as the show starts, it's like this magical wonderland. As soon as the show starts, it goes, It says, all right, first name coming to the stage, and it's my name. They call me. So I run down to the audience and I go down, and then the soccer equipment comes out, and they're like, can you guess the price of the soccer equipment? And I was like, what? And so it was like goals and cleats and jerseys and these giant goalposts. And I lived in Manhattan at the time. And I was like, I don't know how much this is. So I don't remember what I said. And then they go down, they go, okay, closest to the actual retail price is Margot. And I was like, what? So now I've won the soccer equipment. And so then I go on stage and they're like, Margot, this is all happening within like 60 seconds. And then they're like, Margot, how would you like to win a new car? And then I literally like fell on the ground screaming, and I hadn't even won the car, just the thought of winning it. So then they asked me to name the price. And because I lived in Manhattan and I had never owned a car at the time, I was immediately off by like $8,000 in the first guess or something. And I like lost the car within 10 seconds. They're like, brr, brr, brr. So I lose it. So then I sit down, and then they were like, at the commercial break, and Drew Carey's like, so Margot asks me on the commercial break in front of everybody, Margot, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm a teacher. And then he asked the same question, and he said, well, what do you teach? And I said, I teach the art of storytelling to adults. And the whole audience was like, what? And he goes, well, that sounds like a made up job. And in my head, I was like, yeah, I did. So then they tell us at the end of the show that I will, you can either keep the prize that you've gotten and pay some taxes on it. So if it's worth $2,000, you can pay a little bit of tax on it and keep the prize, or you can forfeit and take nothing, and that's it. So I decided, because I lived in Manhattan at the time, that I don't need this soccer equipment. And so I decided I was going to forfeit. So I have this great moment in my head. I was like, this was an experience and this was my dream, and I don't need to walk away with anything but the love I have in my heart, and it's okay. So I let it go. And then I go backstage, and I'm the last person to fill out paperwork, and they were like, Margot, we have a problem with your prize. And I said, okay. And they said, well, the soccer equipment is out of stock, which I thought was so strange because I had just seen it on the stage and now we're right there. And I said, okay, so what does that mean? They said, well, we don't normally do this, but we're going to have to give you the cash value of it. And I said, oh, what's it worth? Because I couldn't even remember. And they're like, it's worth $1,664. And I thought I'd won nothing. And I was like, because it was like as if I had won the car. And then I filled out the paperwork and I ran out, and I saw the same security guard as I ran out, and he goes, what happened? You won. And I looked at him and I go, well, I prayed. I totally didn't pray. I ran out there, and it was truly one of the greatest moments of my life, because I just thought I had nothing, and it was just such a great experience.
What did it feel like to be on the show?
I felt like, I have never felt more at home than I felt on the set of The Price is Right. I just truly felt like I belonged there. It's magical. As it looks on TV, it just looks so magical. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Margot. I really appreciate you coming on. I mean this sincerely. It's a dream come true to meet you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have been on.
I think storytelling for me, after reading your book, feels like a foundational skill that everybody should know.
Absolutely.
And so I really appreciate you writing your book. I appreciate the work you do, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And the books, you're going to plug the book. Should I tell the people?
Oh yeah, the book is called Long Story Short. Everybody buy it. Thank you for listening to the Combinate podcast. If you would like to support the show, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and please share. Please send any feedback you have to combinatepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you again.